Hello and welcome. We will wait a moment to let all participants enter the webinar. Okay, I see numbers are increasing. Welcome to our webinar presenting our brand new European Green Deal Risk Radar and the context of a new EU policy cycle. My name is Jörg Mühlenhoff. I am the head of the European Energy Transition Program at the EU office here in Brussels, Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung. Warm welcome from Brussels to the almost 300 registered participants. For those who do not know us yet, Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung is a political foundation affiliated with the German Green Party. And our main primary task of these political foundations in Germany is to do political education and advocacy in Germany, but also abroad. With today's webinar, we will take the role of a watchdog. After her re-election, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has ensured that Europe will stay the course on all of our goals of the European Green Deal, which was actually her flagship project during her first term. We, however, now see a real risk that the ambition of the Green Deal will be watered down when it comes to fighting the climate crisis, to the biodiversity crisis, and many other issues that are still open, of course. Together with experts from environmental NGOs, we have monitored the current plans and proposals to see if and when potentially these EU laws under the European Green Deal could come under attack during the next months and years in this new legislative term. We will explain in a moment how to read this new publication, this risk radar, and what is in it. But we, of course, do not want to paint a too dark future. Our risk radar also shows, we can illustrate that there is a huge progress that the EU has made since 2019 during the previous legislative term, be it on climate ambition, for renewables, or for citizens' fair participation in the benefits that this Green Deal offers. For the new legislative term now, we take 1 hour today to discuss with 3 invitees and with you, of course, the future of the European Green Deal. Before introducing our 3 experts, a few housekeeping rules. This webinar, obviously, it's recorded and live streamed. After the statement of each of the 3 experts that we have invited, you have the opportunity to ask questions, but please use the Q&A box. Type your question in the Q&A box. We will try to sort that out and identify the questions. With so many participants, we might not be able to pick every single question due to the limited time. We will not use the chat box for this purpose. Use the Q&A box, please. After the webinar, we will make the presentation and recording also available on our website. Over now to our invitees. We will first learn about the findings from our new risk radar by Wendel Trio, an independent climate and policy expert with many, many years of experience in leading positions of environmental NGOs here in Brussels. He's the author of our risk radar. He will be followed by the views from a lawmaker from the European Parliament, MEP Jutta Paulus. From Germany, she's sitting with the Greens EFA Group in the European Parliament. And we will then later be joined by Camille Defard. She's the head of the Jacques Delors Energy Center, and she will discuss with us how the Green Deal actually could become a compelling answer to the rising far-right populism that we have to face. Finally, in the end, we also will ask you, the audience, to vote in an interactive poll online here how you would deal with these risks that we identify. So over now to the first slides. I will briefly explain what is in this Green Deal that we just have launched. You can find it online on our website. It's basically an analysis of 13 most relevant EU laws under the European Green Deal that have been endorsed or are potentially still pending. We picked the most relevant ones in terms of the risks that we identified. There are, of course, more than 100 new laws, directives, regulations, action plans under the European Green Deal. Just in terms of capacity, we picked 13 that we thought are the most interesting and most challenging ones, where we can already see that there might be a conflict coming up. But first of all, we also, in this Green Deal risk radar, we did an assessment of what is in these EU laws in the Green Deal, because there are some good or mixed prospects, and there are also some EU laws where there are rather poor provisions with regards to three main objectives that we consider relevant for the progress and for the success of the Green Deal, meaning climate ambition, a fully renewable energy system, and of course, citizens' fair participation. That's the first thing that we checked with a color coding scheme. You can see that online in an overview, but also in dedicated single scorecards. And then we assessed the risks. We discussed and checked what is discussed, what is published, what have policymakers and governments said, what can you find in the mission letters, for instance, the job descriptions of the new commissioners. And we try to assess the risks. Is there a low, a middle, or really a high risk of these 13 files to be slowed down in view of the progress? Is there potentially a conflict coming up on distributional effects, so lack of finance? Money is always content to be worried and to struggle about. And last but not least, is there a risk that this EU law might be used to open up the door for continued use of fossil fuels or of nuclear energy, which we consider both, of course, as false solutions in view of combating the climate crisis? And you can then find here on the second slide, if you switch the slide, please, in dedicated scorecards, the more detailed assessment, explanations, what will happen when. There is also a timeline that you can use as an orientation to find your way through the maze of European legislation, what will happen in terms of implementing these EU laws. Everything is summarized also in our website. There is an interactive dossier where you can have overview and check also which potentially new commissioner will deal with this file. So when you prepare your cheat list, or when you want to check for the upcoming hearings of the commissioners, when the candidates will be grilled, you can use our scorecards as a kind of orientation, or prepare your questions and check how the new commissioners will react to the challenges and the risks that we have identified here. So without further ado, I'm happy to hand over now to Wendel, the lead author of this Green Deal Risk Radar, and he will explain a bit more the findings.
Thank you, Jörg. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a few words about the work that we've been doing. As Jörg already indicated, the European Green Deal is a massive project, a massive concept of a whole range of initiatives, of which we looked at a number of them to see how much they are at risk. And the risk is there because of the, and you can go to the next slide, because of the new composition, both of the European Parliament, as well as of the nominated European Commission. And if you can see that in both cases, in the European Parliament and in the European Commission, there is a large majority, or a certain majority, of more conservative forces that have been speaking out against certain elements of the Green Deal in the past. Please go to the next slide. If you look at the European Parliament, and this is just one example of the vote on the nature restoration law, which was one of the, let's say, most divisive votes of the past Parliament. If you look at the parties that formed the core of the vote in favor or against, recognizing that, of course, not all members of the European Parliament have been voting according to the party lines. But if you look at the composition of the Parliament in the previous term, then there was a slight majority for the core party supporting the nature restoration law. In the current term, that has been completely changed with majority of parties that in general voted against the nature restoration law. Again, this is just an example, and there's many other files which are less divisive. Next slide. If you look at the European Commission composition, and this kind of also reflects the state of affairs in the EU member states, you see that actually a majority of the EU commissioners that have been nominated belong to one political group in the European Parliament, the European People's Party, far outweighing how they are represented in the European Parliament itself. So this does not necessarily, or the political composition of the European Commission does not necessarily reflect the votes of the European public at the European Parliament election. So a large over-representation of conservatives in the Parliament, the Commission, and also in the member states. And that leads to a perceived risk for some of the elements of the Green Deal. If we go to the next slide, so there's a perceived risk of the Green Deal, and there's definitely a feeling that there's a need to defend the Green Deal, but we also need to acknowledge that the Green Deal is not the answer to everything and is not necessarily the right level of ambition that we need. And there's three key elements that we need to look at from reports that have been recently published. First, with regards to the Sustainable Development Goals, and please go to the next slide, we see that the recent Eurostat report on the monitoring of the progress on the Sustainable Development Goals within the EU, you see that there's a number of files that are in a better position, but there's also a number of files that are in a moderate progress or have actually seen regress. And most of the files that are part of the Green Deal, climate and energy, nature, pollution, are actually at the bottom end of this assessment by Eurostat. So there clearly is still a huge problem. First recognition. Second challenge, next slide. If we then look at one of the core elements of the European Green Deal, the Fit for 55 package of climate and energy legislation, then the assessment of the scientific people behind the Climate Action Tracker actually say that the EU's current plans to reduce emissions by 55% by 2030 are insufficient to represent the EU's fair share of the effort to go towards the Paris Agreement objective to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So the Green Deal is an important step forward, but it is still insufficient. And then if we go to the next slide, and as an indication of the challenge that we have, member states are reluctant to do actually what they have promised. This is one of those examples, the state of affairs of the submission of the final national energy and climate plans by member states. These were due by end of June of this year. And you see the few in greens are the ones that are currently being submitted, although most of them also behind the deadline. But you see that quite a few of the national energy and climate plans are to be submitted in the coming months, and some even unclear when they will be submitted. Those are the ones in red. So just an example that the Green Deal is not the solution to everything, and that there are a number of problems. Next slide, please. Then we don't have the time to go into detail of all of the 13 files that we have been assessing, but just a number of observations on some of the key trends that come out of this assessment. One is that many of the files that seem to be relatively ambitious, that seem to be promising, are actually at risk. And there are two specific files that are perceived most at risk. One is the cars CO2 standards legislation, and in particular, the component of that legislation that deals with the phase out of the internal combustion engine by 2035, which, you know, is heavily contested, especially inside Europe by the car industry. And secondly, the deforestation regulation, which is both contested internally in the EU by farmer groups and industry, etc., but also heavily contested by countries outside of the EU that would be impacted by the deforestation regulations. Those are two very clear examples of pieces of legislation that are at risk of being fundamentally changed or even repealed or strongly delayed, then there's only one file that is not really perceived to be at risk, which is the emissions trading system. This kind of seems to support stronger calls that are still there from many in more conservative parts of society to make the emissions trading system the only or the main policy tool to fight climate change, which would be in contrast with recent findings from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Change Research that looked at 1,500 climate policies all around the world and came to the conclusion that while markets indeed do work, that the best option is still this basket of tools that have different elements that make the biggest impact on fighting climate change. Then we see that many of the files are not necessarily at risk of being amended, changed, or whatever, but have very weak progress in terms of implementation, basically due to or as evidenced by the slow progress on the national energy and climate plans. This relates to both files that have collective EU targets, such as the Renewable Energy Directive, but similarly also the energy efficiency files, as well as two files that have binding targets for member states, such as the effort sharing regulation, where we're also seeing lack of progress and not sufficient planning by member states. Next slide. Other key observations is that there's a number of files that in the further progress on developing implementation acts and other elements that will further define what's in the files face strong lobby from the fossil fuel industry and the nuclear industry. This relates to all the energy files, the Renewables Energy Directive, the electricity market reform, the gas market reform, but also the car CO2 standards. So strong lobby that is actively trying to water down what's actually has been agreed. Two files face strong delay, such as the Energy Taxation Directive, where it's not very clear how and when that will land. And you probably remember that due to the farmers' protests, the Commission retracted the pesticides regulation, and it's not clear what will come in place of that. Similarly, there are question marks about the follow-up of the European climate law, and in particular the 2040 climate target, and how that has been proposed by the Commission, and how that links with the Europe's obligation to present a new climate target under the UNFCCC framework, a climate target for 2035, which in principle needs to be submitted by February of next year. And similarly, it's unclear how the progress will go with the nature restoration law, which again is an important piece of work linked to international negotiations under the Convention of Biodiversity, and it's COP16 that takes place next month. And then one core element related to citizen participation and how citizens can be engaged in the transition will be how the further development of the Social Climate Fund and how that will be put into practice, and that will be an important test for that element of the debate. So coming to the last slides, or the last two slides, looking at what's next. A number of issues are to be expected in the relatively short term. Ursula von der Leyen, in her political guidelines, made promises of delivering a number of issues, a number of proposals in the first 100 days of the Commission. This includes the Clean Industrial Deal, which should also look at how industry can contribute to the needed transition and the net zero target. It's a vision for agriculture and food, as this might be the place where the pesticides regulation comes in again. But also within the next 100 days or by the end of this year, we need to see how the deforestation regulation will be implemented, with a strong call to delay that. So that will be kind of a litmus test of where the European Commission wants to go. And we also are normally should be seeing by the end of the first 100 days the full submission of all the national energy and climate plans of the member states. And it will be in particular important to see how the European Commission will deal with potential gaps in the between the national energy and climate plans and the 2030 targets, and what the Commission will do to fill those gaps. Then early 2025, there's the 2040 climate target and the 2035 nationally determined contribution to the UNFCCC. As I said, in principle, it should be by February 2025. We have to see how that works, but definitely that target will need to be submitted to the UNFCCC before COP30 in Brazil at the end of 2025, which will also be the deadline for the new global climate and energy vision that von der Leyen mentioned in her mission letters to Hoekstra and Jørgensen, the climate and energy commissioners who are tasked with coming up with that vision before the COP in Brazil. Next slide. Then on a bit of a longer term, in 2026 and beyond, quite a number of important issues to happen. There's the review of the cars and CO2 standards, which might be the moment of the strong push against the phase out of the internal combustion engine. So very important to be ready by then to ensure that that doesn't happen. 2026 will also see the start of the implementation of the Social Climate Fund, with member states having to submit their plans already in 2025. And a bit strange, but also in 2026 is there's a scheduled review of the Social Climate Fund, which might not happen that closely after the implementation. Then, of course, we're looking at the new multi-annual financial framework, and there will be a whole process in the run-up to the final decision on that. Also, as part of the mission letters, the commissioners, in particular Hoekstra, have to come up with a new post-2030 climate architecture, and there it will be very important to see what the future will be of the ETS architecture, aligned with the question mark on what the future will be on the second iteration of the ETS, so the parallel version, and also whether other new sectors will be integrated in the ETS. And then finally, there's the review of the electricity market reform, which could possibly be a segue to clear agreement on end dates for the phase out of fossil fuels in the EU. So that's in a nutshell what's some of the core elements of the risk radar, and I give the floor back to Jörg.
Thank you very much, Wendel, for this overview. For those who joined a bit later, you're invited to ask questions by using the Q&A box. You can type your questions there. And we have a bit of time still to deal with these questions. I see a first one to Wendel. I will just read it out. The question is, for the just transition priority of the new Commission, what is needed besides the mentioned Social Climate Fund?
So yeah, it's very clear that if we want to have citizens on board of the transition, there's multiple things that needs to be done. First of all, citizens' needs need to be recognized, and I think that's an important part of how to deal with populism, is that citizens need to feel that their concerns are being taken into account. So that's a whole field of work that really depends on member states, where the Commission doesn't necessarily have the right tools. Then obviously, besides the Social Climate Fund, there's many other elements of funding, subsidies, financial support, etc., that needs to be provided to those who kind of face the most challenging tasks in terms of the transition, also ensuring that the alternatives are available, etc., etc. And thirdly, I think there's an issue of participation, which actually kind of goes to the much broader debate of how do we improve our level of democracy and participation of the public in decision making, and also that is something that will need to be tackled. And then fourthly, there's of course the issue of workers' rights, etc., which is a specific element of the just transition debate that is extremely important, and where of course there needs to be a stronger recognition and a stronger representation of workers in many of the decisions that are being made.
Good. Thanks for this first answer. I see more and more questions popping up. As mentioned, we might not have the time to deal with all of them, but maybe to continue with a second point and adding to the question on just transition, we as the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, we are about to launch also a toolbox presenting instruments that help citizens to better benefit from the energy transition. We decided to stress the social dimension of the energy transition in our work. This toolbox will be launched on the 21st of November. So for the attendee who asked this question, save the date, 21st of November, we will present more content on this specific angle. Thanks for this question. Maybe we can add a second one, which is the one on, Teresa Ribera, which is nominated by the Spanish government. What role will she play with regards to ensuring the future of the Green Deal, if we knew that? But Wendel, maybe you have an idea.
Yes, indeed. I think it's a very important question. I think it's as such a good sign that somebody who has a proven track record of knowing the file, knowing the challenges related to energy transition, having been confronted with many challenges, and I mean, she's also not a saint, so she has also made mistakes in Spain. But it's definitely a good sign that she has this specific position. I think, of course, it will be challenging because she will be functioning within a college of commissioners that is largely conservative, with the EPP having the majority. So in case of pure college votes, she will have a tough time. So in that sense, she will have to cooperate with conservatives, and in particular those who fall within her team, such as Wopke Hoekstra and Jessica Roswell. I think probably she can also learn from the previous experiences of Timmermans, who was in a relatively similar position, and ensure that she takes over the good things he did and learns from the mistakes he made, and see how she can really push forward. I think finally, if I may say, I think one of her advices positive elements, and which makes her stronger, is the fact that she combines the transition with the competition portfolio, which actually gives her even greater importance than Timmermans had before.
Great. Many thanks again, Wendel, for this overview and for answering these questions. We will try to answer some of them in the box. I'll get back to you individually, but we need to go on. We have 1 hour, and I would like to now take the view of the European Parliament. Wendel, you already alluded to the role of the Parliament. Will it remain a driver of ambitious policies for people and the planet, or will we also see a backlash there with its new composition? There could be no better witness than Jutta Paulus, MEP, sitting with the Greens EFA Group. Jutta, you have been following very closely many of the legislative files under the Green Deal during the past 5 years, for instance, as a rapporteur or shadow rapporteur on important EU laws like methane emissions reduction, nature restoration law. What are your learnings from the past legislative term?
Yes, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for actually bringing forward this important webinar to, let's say, bring home to the people how the Green Deal was running in the past and how it might be running in the current mandate. You have already mentioned that I have been shadowing quite a few files of the Green Deal in the climate and energy sector, but also in the nature sector. And actually the successful legislation that was mentioned was very much focusing on climate and energy. And we haven't gotten really far on nature. Of course, we did, thank God, we did have at the end of the day, the successful vote on the nature restoration law in the European Parliament and in the Council, but it was extremely divisive. It was a very polarized discussion. And it showed that whenever it gets to, let's say, bringing home things on the ground, then things become difficult. We had this huge opposition from the farming lobby, of course, to the nature restoration law. But what is largely, let's say, forgotten a bit is that we don't have, let's say, the relevant drive to actually do something on nature, right? We haven't done anything on pollution, for example, which is also part of climate crisis, but also of the nature crisis, which is really, for me, it's a very relevant issue. And we have seen with the PFAS project that it is really important to have this zero pollution ambition going forward. We haven't seen anything like that in the last mandate. And I doubt a bit whether we will see something good on it in this mandate, because the mission letter says bring clarity on PFAS, which is not saying provide that people's health is not endangered by PFAS, which would be my take, but bring clarity in brackets to industry or to who. So there, I'm not sure whether we will be able to see substantial progress, because as has been mentioned before, we have those conservative right-wing majority now in the Parliament, also in the Council and also in the Commission. So it will be an uphill battle to defend what we have already achieved in the Green Deal. You have maybe noticed that the automotive sector is calling for revising the CO2 standards for 2025, which we weren't even agreed on in the last mandate, but in the mandate before. So, well, I would like to say to the sector, hey, you guys, you've had a lot of time to prepare for this. And now that you find out, oh, okay, we didn't prepare so well, so please undo the standards. This is not the way that I would like European legislation to function, right? Especially since one of the companies, which is situated in my home country in Germany, doled out $15 billion to their shareholders in the last year. So I don't think it's really relevant to say, hey, you don't have the means to really adapt to these issues. And we've already seen that the Conservatives are teaming up with the far right now, only for non-binding legislation like the Venezuela resolution. But I've heard from my colleagues, which are working on budget, which are working on the COP resolution, that ECR and EPP are working very closely together, which is a bit, let's say, it makes me a bit nervous when it comes to future legislation, and also that I really fear that we might see a fallback or a backtracking on the Green Deal, even though Ms. von der Leyen has promised that this might not happen, that this will not happen. So I'm really anxious to learn how this is going to work in the future. And when you also asked me at the beginning of the webinar, when we were still discussing who's going to do what makes you optimistic? Well, the optimistic thing is that Ms. von der Leyen has said there will be no backtracking on the Green Deal, and we will have to hold her by her word. And this is something which we will emphasize in the hearings of the commissioners, which will take place in October and November, where we will closely read the mission letters and say, hey, Mr. Hansen, Agri Commissioner, are you going to work on actually putting into law the outcome of the strategic dialogue? Hey, Mr. Hoekstra, are you going to make sure that the energy taxation will be working towards the climate transition? Also, Ms. Roswell, you're supposed to do something on zero pollution and on circular economy. What are going to be your concrete steps? So the crunch time will be October, November, and then probably in December we will have the vote on the complete college. And there I'm not sure whether we can be optimistic so much, because we know that the conservatives, let's put it that way, they don't really like Teresa Ribera, right? So my fear is that they will try to strike deals with other groups. We will only not vote Ribera down if, and that is something that could be really a problem, because Ribera is really a strong fighter for climate and biodiversity, always has been ever since she started her career. And we really need her also for making sure that DG Competition, she's going to be also the commissioner which is working on competition, will no longer stand in the way of the clean transition, because we have seen in the last mandate that DG Comp takes ages to allow member states to bring forward policies that actually help in the transition. Happy to hear your questions.
Great. We have indeed some questions for Jutta already in the Q&A box. You're invited to type your questions there. I would pick the first one, which indeed deals again with the promises of Ursula von der Leyen. The question is, she promised not to backtrack on the goals of the Green Deal, but she leaves open the question regarding the actions of the Green Deal. She has already backtracked on pesticide reduction. Indeed, you can see that in our risk radar. There's a dedicated file. This makes it that much more important to extract promises from the new commissioners in the hearings. Who can you team up with to extract such promises? Who are allies?
Well, fortunately, some of the colleagues who I have been working with in the last mandate are again MEPs. And so the crucial point will be that we need to bring our allies together so that we have, let's say, reasonable negotiators on the respective files. And I think what we all should keep in mind, that the Green Deal is not only about protecting climate and nature and saving us from pollution, but it's also about competitiveness. And our European car makers are, let's say, in a tough place also because they basically did not make the right moves in time. And I think we have to show also to, let's say, the more skeptic MEPs that this is actually the only way forward if we don't want to fall behind ever more behind the US and China, for example, when it comes to battery electric vehicles. And there I think we can really do a, let's say, a good teaming up, because there are reasonable forces, not only in my political group, of course, but also in others. And that is the way which I want to take.
Okay, we have maybe time for 1-2 very short questions. Question from Katharina from the box. In your opinion, how likely is a postponement of the EU deforestation regulation as requested by the European People's Party?
I expect that we will see a postponement by maybe half a year, to give the Commission more time to actually work on the templates which they were supposed to provide earlier, because I do understand that, for example, in my home country, we have a lot of very small forest owners, and they cannot fulfill the regulation if they don't have an access point digitally where they can easily move up their pictures, their GIS data, whatever is needed. So I do think that we might see a postponement, but we will make sure that there is a clear action plan also by the Commission to make sure that the regulation doesn't, it doesn't make sense to postpone it for 6 months and within this 6 months nothing happens. Of course, we will have to see action by the Commission in these 6 months to make sure that our European forest owners can fulfill this regulation.
Okay. Many thanks, Jutta, for joining us. I know you're busy. There are sessions in the parliament, and I know we stole a bit of your lunch break, maybe. But thanks for joining. Looking forward to keep in touch. We unfortunately have to go on there. I see there are still many more questions popping up. We will try to answer separately, bilaterally later. But let's maybe have a look to a topic that has been very prominent in the elections campaign, that is, of course, very visible, and there is a risk that goes far beyond the European Green Deal, which is the rise of the far-right parties, not only in the European Parliament. So the recent Eurobarometer that just was published yesterday, I think, confirms that a huge majority of Europeans still want more climate action. They fully support the energy transition, and they expect also politicians to act right now. They see the benefits of a clear, safe, and secure and affordable renewable energy supply. However, populists are pretty successful in blaming climate policies and the energy transition for higher bills and for many other things that citizens can be frustrated about. They successfully instrumentalize this sentiment to provoke a resentment, protest. They frame it as an elitist project, while renewables, as far as I see, in contrast to fossil nuclear, are solutions that citizens really can own and control on the local ground. So we have as last and third speaker Camille Defard. She's the head of the Jacques Delors Energy Center. Camille, you already wrote about the yellow vests in France, which was maybe one of the first signs in 2018 that there is some room for improvement, let's say it like this, for the social dimension of the Green Deal, of ambitious energy and climate policies. How can we bring the benefits of the Green Deal, of the energy transition better to the households, to the citizens? What are your findings and ideas?
Thanks a lot, Jörg, and thanks to the Heinrich-Böll Foundation for the invitation. So indeed, there is this discrepancy between the fact that citizens actually support the green transition, but on the other side, you have had a huge energy price crisis. You have now a cost of living crisis that makes many of the clean solutions unaffordable for citizens. Getting a heat pump, renovating your house, or using an electric car is something that requires investments at the individual level. On the other side, if you want to change your mobility patterns, for example, to walk more or maybe to use more public transportation, or to cycle your kids to school, for example, this actually requires public infrastructures that citizens will be unable to actually finance by themselves. And so on the background of this huge support for the climate transition, you also have over 1/3 of Europeans that struggle paying their bills, meaning that they don't have the room for investing in individual solutions. And so we're at this stage where the European Green Deal, I think this has been highlighted. We've made huge progress over the past years, but we're now facing an implementation challenge. And now that we have the good EU regulations, we actually need to acknowledge that the EU actually has limited financial and technical support to provide to member states, to citizens, to sectors to actually make these regulations a reality. So the good thing is that it's not an if question anymore. It's not if we're going to make these changes, it is how. The issue is that how to implement these profound changes in mobility patterns, in housing, in the industry base of the European Union, this will actually impact people's jobs, people's daily lives. And there are high levels of uncertainty on how is this going to happen, because you can have large risks of job losses in high emitting sectors, which can be problematic if you don't have alternative good employment in the area. There's the risk of unaffordability of both fossil and clean energy sources for households. And there's also a risk of energy security, as we've seen with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the thing is that we need to avoid being over-rely on one single supplier for the new clean technology that we will be the backbone of the transition. So all these risks, if not taken into account by our politicians, then this could fuel actually political frustration, social backlash, as we've seen in France for the yellow vest, but also more recently in Germany against the ban on gas boilers, for example, but also economic disruptions that have social consequences as well. And so this could slow down the transition and increase its costs. And as you've rightly highlighted in your introduction, the far right is really using this tension to earn votes. And we can see their success as already an expression of mistrust towards institutions. Citizens don't believe institutions will be able to protect them from the current economic and social insecurity, as well as the future ones. And the problem is that the EU Green Deal is actually adding to the uncertainty and the insecurity, because you don't know which energy source you're going to be able to use next year. You don't really know how much you're going to have to pay your energy bills. And the traditional, or at least the energy sources that you're using now are actually put into question by green policies. So the recommendations that we've made in our paper that we published earlier this year ahead of the elections was first to focus on building trust and to have mechanisms within the European Green Deal to actually foster this trust through mechanisms for support, protection, and dialogue. First, because we need to offer support and protection based on a differentiated capacity to change and acknowledge the differentiated impacts of the transition. The transition will not impact everyone the same, be it between sectors, between member states, or between households. And the second big element that we need to also work on during this next term is to have a more open and inclusive governance model that would allow us to have better dialogue between citizens and policymakers, between policymakers and stakeholders, so that we can identify the risks and address them as we go, because we don't have time now to, and there are many uncertainties that will pop up in any case. So maybe to come back to maybe go into a bit more details of the recommendations that you can find in our paper in any case. The first big recommendation is to have more financial solidarity at the EU level and at the household level. So this actually implies to use more EU funding to improve coordination, have stricter green conditionality, invest in skills, clean tech manufacturing, clean infrastructure. And that actually implies to have a greater EU budget. There are many options to do this, but also to have more instruments to that are really targeted to the social dimension of the Green Deal, and for example, to enhance the financial envelope of the Social Climate Fund could be one avenue to explore. The second big batch of recommendations concern the skills and labor market changes. One of the measures that could support EU policies on that regard could be to extend, for example, the Just Transition Fund to the car industry. That isn't concerned for now, but that is going to undergo huge changes and transformations that need to be taken care of. Improving training offer to actually strengthen green skills among the population and address skills shortages. So building on the Pact for Skills, and I've seen in the mission letters and the political guidelines of von der Leyen that skills is going to be still a prominent topic for the next term. Let's see now if there are concrete measures to actually make this a reality. And the third big batch of recommendations concern a more inclusive governance. Among this, you need to be able to better anticipate the risks and the struggles and the constraints of all the actors that are going to have to change. And the thing is that everybody's going to have to change at some level. So having more structured dialogues between stakeholders and policymakers could actually improve the quality of policymaking. You can see this, for example, for the Net Zero Industry Act. that there are many decisions that need to be taken through delegated acts from the Commission, and the Commission actually doesn't have the knowledge to actually make these decisions. And all of the measures that we propose to actually strengthen the Green Deal and make it as a tool to actually address populism and to address the mistrust and to rebuild trust among the society, many of these are very political measures that also need to have stronger legitimacy. If you think of increasing the EU budget, you can already know that this is going to be a huge fight. And this is why it would be very interesting to have an annual permanent citizen assembly on climate at the EU level to discuss such critical issues. So to discuss burden sharing, to discuss the struggles of common citizens to actually meet these goals, to actually push also for some options that may be very hard to consider for member states, but that may be actually quite consensual if you look at the situation from a different perspective. So maybe to also extend on one challenge that hasn't been addressed by the Green Deal 1.0, I would say, is the shift from energy consumption to material consumption. So we've seen with the Critical Raw Material Act that there is a need to strengthen the circular economy of the European Union. This is something that Ursula von der Leyen also wants to achieve. And this is where we can see that sufficiency could actually play a role. Sufficiency could actually allow policies to address energy security and material demand tension. So I know that sufficiency is not a trendy term in Brussels, but one very concrete sufficiency measure that could actually enhance the social acceptability of electric vehicles, but also of new mines in Europe, could be to reduce the size of electric vehicles. So I know electric vehicle is going to be a huge battle. It is already a huge battle, but reducing the size of electric vehicles is actually a sufficiency measure that could actually allow Europeans to better address a market segment that is currently dominated by China. So it could also be a matter of industrial policy for the future, but also making electric vehicles affordable for citizens while sparing scarce critical raw materials resources. So I will conclude here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Camille. And indeed, you already touched upon one, let's say, buzzword that is maybe not the most popular in EU institutions, sufficiency. But you linked it in a very interesting way to this new clean industrial deal. And often, this is maybe a first question, often this sufficiency discourse is viewed as, maybe putting even another additional risk to the whole green policy area, because it is seen as imposing abstinence, rejecting, renouncing to something which consumers often don't want to. Wouldn't we have a hard time if we integrate sufficiency? I know in France the debate is a bit different. Maybe you can expand a bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, I took this example because it is also a debate that we're having in France with a new lithium mine that is currently in the public debate. And one very interesting thing that emerges from this public debate is that it seems common sense to reduce the size of electric vehicles that will be built based of the batteries that will come from this mine. If you damage the environment, because there will be damage to the environment, then you need to also make sure that these scarce resources are used wisely and used in a way that is beneficial for the community. So you can see a lot of citizen backlash against a use of this lithium that would be considered as excessive, as luxury. And so building SUVs, electric SUVs using these mines would actually lower the social acceptability of the mine. And whereas if you say we're going to make small electric cars, or we're going to make electric buses for you, then it makes it more for everyone, and it strengthens actually the the social acceptability of these new mines.
Good. I see one question in the box that just jumps on this topic. What policy do you suggest to get the market to produce the smaller electric vehicles that you call for?
Yeah, there's two ways that we suggested. First, to introduce a weight component in the definition of a zero emission vehicle. A second one is also to target EU funding, but also national funding towards manufacturing of small affordable electric vehicles. So there's two ways. There's the regulation and there's the financial incentive. But making this a priority would actually really enable the shift from the industrial shift that hasn't happened in the past. And the thing is that we are now subsidizing electric vehicles that need to be affordable for citizens. And the thing is that we're subsidizing Chinese electric vehicles. So that doesn't really make sense for citizens either.
Hey, a warm thank you again to Camille and also the other two speakers, Wendel and Jutta. Now it's time to ask the audience, you, the participants. We have prepared a little online poll for you here in this Zoom room. We would like to ask you, how would you de-risk the European Green Deal? And we have prepared some options. You heard many potential solutions from our three speakers. Up to you now to identify one priority. Of course, this is not cannot be complete. Take a bit of time to choose your option, your proposal. How can we, in the new legislative term, de-risk the European Green Deal? Should we first convince member states just to set ambitious climate targets for 2035 and 2040? Or should we prioritize local authorities as the transition managers, looking into the next multi-annual financial framework? We talked a lot about the financing, the money that is missing, fiscal questions. Third option, should we secure stable and low renewable electricity prices, first of all, for households and for the businesses? Or fourth option, make the European Central Bank back a European building renovation loan. Last solution might be, we already talked about her, just hand over all relevant files to our new potential commissioner, Teresa Ribera. So your choice is, I hope so, made. I think we can close this little poll. And I would like to ask the colleagues, if possible, to show the results of our little survey. Okay, that's interesting. We see priority is given to boosting the local level to empower local authorities financially speaking, but also, again, economic priority. We need affordable energy. We have seen the question of lowering the prices in the new mission letters for the future commissioners. So the new commission indeed has put the priority there, and you apparently share this priority when I see the results of this little survey. So it's almost past. We have 2 minutes left, maybe for a last round to close with one question. I would like to invite all our three guests, three speakers, turn on your camera for a last little panel. So after so many risks and threats that we heard about in this hour, let's maybe try at the end now to be a bit more positive and on a positive note. What does make you optimistic for the new legislative term? Maybe we can start with Jutta. You already alluded to it.
Yes, thanks a lot. What makes me optimistic, I already said that Ms. von der Leyen has promised that there will be no backtracking on the Green Deal. What makes me optimistic also, we had a reception this week where all the, let's say, usual suspects, so the relevant NGOs, were inviting MEPs, and there were MEPs from all democratic political groups. So we have allies in every political group that want to bring the Green Deal forward, that want to do climate action, that want to do nature protection, that want to work on pollution and health. And we just have to team up and get things done. And it doesn't help to say, oh, the elections were so bad. Oh, there's this huge backlash. Oh, the far right is rising. Yes, but if we don't do anything about it, things will not change. So it's just get to work. And there's a lot of people that have understood. And that's my hope for the next mandate.
Good. Let's get to work. Over to Wendel. One last sentence or comment from your side.
Yes, thanks. So, I mean, like Jutta, I think it's an important sign that Ursula von der Leyen has stressed her support for the Green Deal, despite all the backlash from her own political grouping. So that's an important sign. And secondly, I would say I see a lot of improvements in growing recognition of the synergies, and that's visible in Teresa Ribera's portfolio with the transition and competition as kind of one package. It's also visible in the Green Deal, where also the Green Deal should be integrated. And it's visible at a different level with growing synergy between the Convention on Biodiversity and the Framework Convention on Climate Change. So there's a lot of recognition there, and I see a lot of opportunities. Thank you.
Many thanks again. And Camille, what does make you optimistic for the next legislative term?
Yeah, I mean, building of what Wendel and Jutta just highlighted, I think we see an increasingly the synergies of the green transition, the social dimension of this transition, as well as competitiveness and security. That actually allows us to work with different kind of actors and make new coalitions. Be it from the citizen side, you see more and more organized society organizations involved in the climate space, although they weren't previously, it wasn't their first purpose. Similarly, you can see the Draghi report that really draws these links, and that is reflected in the new commission. And I think that is also reflected with the organizations with which us at the Jacques Delors Institute are now increasingly working with, we're working more with businesses, we're working more with NGOs. And I think this is reflecting the acknowledgement of the synergies that make us expand the coalitions that are supporting our MEPs and Ursula von der Leyen to actually make these bold moves.
Great. So a lot to do for the next 5 years, for sure. We have quite some ideas and guidance now where to focus on. Enjoy reading our new risk radar. If you have any questions, we are happy to answer them. Sorry we weren't able to deal with all the questions in the box. Happy to reach out to you bilaterally later, and see you maybe on the 21st of November here in Brussels, when we launch together with the Green European Foundation our new series of tools to bring the benefits of the energy transition in a fair way to citizens. See you then. Thank you very much again for joining. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.